For his analysis on Australia's response to the invasion of Ukraine and a whole lot more, let's bring in the national editor of the Australian newspaper, as we do on a Monday, Mr Dennis Shanahan, joining me now from Canberra. Dennis, at midnight last night, Australia's financial sanctions and the travel bans on the Russian President Vladimir Putin and his key allies all clicked into effect. The Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, has confirmed today the Morrison government is working with NATO to provide lethal military aid. Not yet decided, but it's certainly in train. There is a meeting of the National Security Committee which will finalise this, we're told, tomorrow. Interesting, Dennis. I listened to Chalmers, the Labor Shadow Treasurer. He has backed calls to send these weapons to Ukraine. He, in fact, used the words weapons specifically. Now, that says to me Labor knows that punters want to see more done to help the Ukrainians, and Jim Chalmers is very strong today. How do you see it?
Look, I think that's right, Peter. I think that the Australian people are very much behind Ukraine, including some Russian Australians who are astounded at Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine. And I think that the behaviour being exposed by the Ukrainian people is lifting a lot of spirits, and people are hoping that they can just hold out. Tonight in Canberra, the Parliament will be swathed in the colours of the Ukrainian flag as a sign from the Australian people to those in Ukraine. But I think that politically it is clear Labor has been very careful to ensure that it has been behind every action the government has taken. The government has also been quick. Let's face it, Australia, with Boris Johnson, were well out in front on the question of sanctions, particularly the SWIFT, the banking sanctions against Russia. And I think that this has been well received and backed by Labor as well. There is no politics in this. If anyone attempts to politicise it, they will be damaged. I think what we're going to see is strong bipartisanship, and that in itself is good politics backed by good policy and also accelerating policy. We've seen very quickly that the Prime Minister initially saying, oh, no, we wouldn't expel the Russian ambassador, to now saying, well, we're contemplating that. So I think quick-moving responses to a very quick-moving situation.
I couldn't agree with your point on the politics more. Let's go to the poll, the news poll in the Australian today. Very little movement again for the government. Opposition both sort of sitting where they were. Primary vote for the coalition lifted 1 point to 35%, still in an unwinnable situation. Labor unchanged on 41. 2PP unchanged, 55-45 against the government. Now, the best way, I think, to read these published polls, I'm a bit problematic to read too much into them compared to the polls that you see when you work in politics. But I have to say the best way to read them is about reading the trend. The trend's been against the government for some time here. But I'm wondering, this renewed focus on national security, even with the very clear bipartisanship, that may play out for the government, mightn't it?
Well, I think so. Look, the one sign there for the government is that the primary vote after two surveys, 34%, has moved to 35%. Now, that's not really a shift, but it could be the beginning of a sign that the bad polling for the government has bottomed out. The other positive from the invasion of Ukraine for Australian politicians is that the strong position being taken by both leaders, Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese, has helped lift both their personal ratings. And look, one other thing that is also interesting, and particularly about this poll, and that is for the first time, the United Australia Party has been broken out. And what we've actually seen here, as we've talked previously about this big division on the conservative side of politics amongst independents and conservative parties, is that the UAP is actually ahead of One Nation. There is a total of 17 still in the others column and a very high 8% uncommitted in the poll. So we still have close to a quarter of the population still not voting for the major parties or the Greens. Greens improved slightly. So overall, what we're seeing is not much change, but could be the beginning of an improvement for the coalition. Certainly, it will be an improvement for Scott Morrison. And remember this, when you talk about the trends, you're quite right. You don't just look at what happened last week in what happened at a poll on the weekend. Sometimes they're reacting to things that have occurred 3 or 4 weeks previously, and it takes a long time for that to come through. So we may not see the full impact of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine on Australian politics for another couple of weeks at least.
I do think this point you're making about the crossbench vote, the undecided vote, the minor party and the undecided vote, I think that the issues in Ukraine, concerns about China, the unsettling events overseas, I think that's going to see a flight back to the two major parties, Dennis.
Well, I think that is the case, and I think I've said that before, that as the poll gets closer, I think that there'll be much more emphasis on the major parties. Even this week, although it was only 1 point, it was still an increase for the Greens after Adam Bandt went out, tried to distance himself from the whole idea that he was just part of the ALP, and ran a very concerted campaign to put up a Greens position to attract back some of those voters who were standing for the voices of independents, the pure Green candidates. And so I think that it's interesting what's happening out there. And I think that there will be more of a movement back to the major parties as we get closer to the election.
All right, quick comment on this today. The New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption found that Chinese billionaire Huang Zhimo, who is allegedly an agent of Chinese Communist Party influence, was the source of a $100,000 donation to the New South Wales Labor Party back in 2015. This issue of Chinese influence and dodgy donations is dogging New South Wales Labor at the moment, isn't it?
Well, it is indeed. And look, this was always a dodgy arrangement. $100,000 in a brown paper bag or an Aldi shopping bag was always going to be a problem. It's become at a greater problem, apart from the findings of ICAC on the basis that there has been corruption. It's also bad for the federal Labor Party, who is trying to fight a campaign suggesting that they're soft on China, they're open to influence from China. And just as we go into the election campaign, here is a finding of corruption involving the New South Wales Labor Party donations, $100,000 from Chinese donors, and they have been linked with the Communist Party. This is very bad for the Labor Party, and I think that it couldn't have come at a worse time for Anthony Albanese.
I don't think this will be the last we hear of it. Dennis Shanahan, thank you as always.